Our next keynote speaker brings a wealth of experience straight from Silicon Valley. She is the executive director of Berkeley SkyDeck, UC Berkeley's premier startup accelerator and a global hub for entrepreneurship. She's here today to share her insights with us on how to build sustainable ecosystems. Please join me in welcoming Caroline Winnett.
I need the clicker. They'll bring the clicker. All right. Well, while they're bringing the clicker and putting up the screens and all of that, hello, everybody. How are you today? How's the first day? Is it good? Fantastic? All right. We're going to try to make it even more fun. So let me start with a little story. I was born and raised in Berkeley, California in the 1960s. My parents didn't take me to church on Sunday. They took me to peace marches. I remember one day standing with my father next to the UC Berkeley campus, and a big protest was going on there. And the National Guard came and started firing tear gas everywhere, so my dad scooped me up and ran down as fast as he could to get me away. Got to safety, it was all fine. I was a very small child at that time, but I knew that something was happening. And indeed, I was in the epicenter of the counterculture revolution of the 1960s. This culture is the single most important reason that Silicon Valley is where it is and is what it is. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, hello, everybody. I'm Caroline Winnett, the Executive Director of Berkeley SkyDeck. We are UC Berkeley's premier startup accelerator. We host about 250 startups per year. We're open to not just Berkeley, but founders from all over the world, including Sweden. How many founders in the audience today? Founders? Awesome. We love seeing your applications for SkyDeck. So in the past years, we've developed a program where organizations, including the Swedish Energy Agency, anybody here from there? You're one of our partners. Send startup to SkyDeck to learn about Silicon Valley. And more, they're asking us to come to them to give workshops, lectures on bringing that Silicon Valley mindset to their ecosystem. So for the past 10 years, I've been running this program, watching startups come and go. And so it is from this experience at SkyDeck that I'm talking to you today about startup ecosystems. So when you leave, I hope you have an understanding of what is the most important thing, what's a framework you can use to build your own ecosystem, and what are some of the biggest mistakes that we see over and over again. Sound good? You ready? Okay, let's go. You can see from this picture here that before my career, I like to say my career before SkyDeck, I was a serial killer. I mean serial entrepreneur. And I did not kill some of them. They grew up and got acquired. But before that, I was a professional concert violinist. And it is from this perspective that I like to analyze the startup world. So let's do that. So in this metaphor of the symphony of innovation that is created by a thriving startup ecosystem, these are the founders, the conductors, very flamboyant, very energetic, a little crazy. Not going to lie. That's Gustavo Dudamel, one of the world's great conductors. Highly recommend. If you can ever go see him, please do. Like great founders, he's a force of nature, and his passion will knock you off your feet from 100 feet back in the audience. And then, who are the team members? Who's helping build this great startup? The musicians. Important point, important takeaway. If you don't have talented musicians, builders, founders, team members that are well-trained, your orchestra, your symphony of innovation is not going to sound very good. This is a critical point. So there's an interesting analogy. Startups and orchestras have something very critical in common, and that is that neither one of them has a viable business model, and they both rely on benefactors and patrons, right? So benefactors and patrons for the orchestras, investors for the startup world. And who coaches and trains these people? In the music world, it's teachers, and in the startup world, it's, of course, mentors. Government. Who here is in the government building a startup ecosystem? Anybody here? You own the concert hall. You hire the stagehands. The whole concert is not happening without you. It's just not. But you get no applause, and you get no glory. But you're critical, and you can make this whole concert happen. Super important. And then what everybody's going for, of course, is a standing ovation by the market, by the audience, coming back for more over and over again for that startup ecosystem, et cetera. So with this symphony of innovation in mind, how come Silicon Valley is without question the number one? We all can talk about what's number 2 through number 10, et cetera, but nobody's debating what's number 1, right? So we talked about you've got to have that culture, and we're going to come back to that, but you also have to have the talent, the other through line, the other bass melody for today. And it's no accident that all great startup ecosystems, including Stockholm, and any other one you want to list, has many of these universities, top-tier universities, research universities. You can't build a startup ecosystem without them. If you try, you're going to have a very hard time. Second most important point about the talent. You probably know the numbers, Silicon Valley. How many of the great startups from Silicon Valley were founded by immigrants to Silicon Valley? Who knows? 50%, right? You've got to have the talent flowing in as well as the talent who lives there, right? What's the culture of California? Informal, right? Immigrants are welcome. Doesn't matter who you are or where you're from or what language you speak. People are welcome there. This is absolutely critical to your ecosystem, that culture of inclusivity. That incredibly important topic, highly debated politically right now, but in the startup world is critical. And then on top of all of this, the tempo is insane. I cannot overemphasize how fast you have to move if you're going to have a great startup ecosystem. Over and over again, I see startups come to SkyDeck from outside, and they're just at a slower pace. They're talented, they're well-trained, but they got to run. I'm not going to run across the stage. You can imagine. Here's a quick example. When I'm talking to somebody about giving them an introduction, I have failed unless I've made that introduction on my phone before the conversation is over. That's how fast we have to move. Those of you in the government, don't discount your influence for influencing the ecosystem at the very beginning. This happened in Silicon Valley. You probably all know that government funding was a very important part of what happened. It's not the only thing, but it's an important thing. What you might not know is that in California in the 70s, there was actually another ecosystem in the United States that was putting us some big competition. It was in Boston, Massachusetts. It was called Route 128. And they wanted to be the Silicon Valley. They didn't make it. And part of the reason is the culture, without question, the West Coast versus East Coast. But here's another big reason. In California, it's very difficult to enforce a non-compete. So you're a startup founder, you want to go quit your company and go start something. Not so hard in California. In Massachusetts, it was harder. That one factor had ramifications over and over and over again to prevent unicorns. So look at your employment laws. And then, of course, it all leads to what, of course, you all know is a risk-tolerant culture. Failure is not a failure. It's a stepping stone. That's why I'm happy to make a joke about I was a serial killer, right? No, serial entrepreneur. Everybody laughs. It is not a sign of weakness or a sign that you're stupid or that you shouldn't be a founder. It's just I found out 4 or 5 ways, depending how you count it, to not do a startup before I did some that succeeded. So let's talk about Stockholm. Stockholm is currently ranked on the Startup Genome, which is the most well-regarded list of startup ecosystems, is number 23, which I think is a fantastic place because you're going up from there, right? And I've been very impressed with this event here today. You've got the Prime Minister, you've got a minister. I understand that this conference some years ago was in some small concert hall with 500 people, right? Those of you who've been going for a couple of years, it's a much bigger deal, right? Yeah, much bigger deal. So what I like to say about Stockholm, small orchestra, only, 980,000 people live here in Stockholm, but some great conductors. In fact, Stockholm has the highest per capita number of unicorns of any ecosystem, including Silicon Valley. So well done. Spotify, Klarna, Skype, right? Fantastic. There's a nice bullet list of all the things that this culture has, making very digitally native people, highly trained, great research universities in Sweden, right here in Stockholm, right? KTH, Karolinska. You've got the talent, right? And then the social safety net. That's important. Many cultures don't have that. So if you fail in your startup, here, that net helps catch you. That is absolutely critical for founders. So what's missing here in Stockholm? It's pretty hard to grow a big ecosystem when the number of the people here is that small. That said, the original definition of Silicon Valley, which today includes the whole Bay Area, San Francisco, Berkeley, many million people, the original boundaries of Silicon Valley were very small. And it wasn't even the number of people here in Stockholm. So I'd say difficult, but not overcomable, right? But one thing that you don't have enough here in Stockholm, and this is an issue with many, many startup cultures around the world, you got to have the talent here, which you do, but they've got to be coming here. If you could pick one metric by which to judge your startup ecosystem, how many founders want to come there? How many founders outside of Sweden are applying to the accelerators in Sweden? At Berkeley SkyDeck, we get about 6,000 applications per year for our accelerator programs. Over half of those, probably 60% of them, are from startups that are not based in the United States. In fact, only about 15% of them are startups that are actually based in Silicon Valley. This is what you want to see. You want to see people coming from all around the world because they know that Stockholm is the place to build. So it's a growing hub with fantastic fundamentals. And I can't wait to see what happens. By the time we have the next Techarena, let's see how many spots you shoot up in that startup genome list. Another country that we've been working with a lot at Berkeley SkyDeck is Japan. Very interesting startup ecosystem. I would call Tokyo the place where you're going to find lots of those talented musicians. There are 7 imperial universities in Japan. There are many research organizations, and it is also, like Sweden, a highly educated population. It's also much larger. What's the population of just Tokyo? 40 million, something like that. So they got that going for them. The government of Japan has been extraordinarily intentional about supporting the startup ecosystem. They've allocated billions of dollars. They're pushing very, very hard, and they're sending a lot of this funding to those universities because they understand that's where the talent is coming from. By the way, sidebar on universities. Anybody here from a university? So, important point. How are you handling your IP? Because at Berkeley, we're supposedly very good at this, right? We've been at it for a while. We're in Silicon Valley. It's still hard. So look at your IP, those of you who talk to universities, and make sure you're not making some gigantic blunders, which we often see, right? The IP is so closely held by the university it can't be spun off, or the university wants 50% of the company, which means it's a dead-on arrival, to investors, or, such is the case here in Sweden, it's owned entirely by the inventor and often just sits there. I see somebody nodding right there. So what are the constraints, going back to Japan? If California was and continues to be culturally the #1 place for startups because of who we are culturally, we could make the argument that Japan is 100% unfriendly culturally to startups, right? And they themselves are quite aware of this. It's very traditional, it's very hierarchical, it's extremely formal, there's many layers before a low-status founder can meet a high-status CEO, et cetera, et cetera. It's also a place, unlike Sweden, where people speak English extremely well, and English is the international language for the startup world. In Japan, proficiency is rather low. That is changing, younger generation, more English proficient, but it still holds them back when it comes to an international startup ecosystem. And I would say both ecosystems, Stockholm and Japan, need to attract more people. They're not cultures that have giant waves of tech talent immigrating, as we do in Silicon Valley. And I would say this is, as I mentioned, probably if you had to pick one metric of what's a good ecosystem, pick that one. Are founders coming to you? And most ecosystems around the world struggle with that in a way that Silicon Valley does not. So let's talk about those of you who want to build. You can just go build stuff. It's not impossible. It's not all culture. You can build co-working spaces, right? Startups in these little tiny offices that they can come and go freely and grow up, et cetera. You can build a lot of these things, those of you in the government, and some of this is a tax, accounting, et cetera, et cetera. Please take a hard look at your immigration, your tax policies, all of that, and be brutally honest. This is another big takeaway I want for today. Please be brutally honest with yourself and your ecosystem. If your tax, if your immigration is unfriendly, see what you can do about it, right? Put as much funding as you can, but here's another takeaway. Don't feed the weak. Lots of politicians are trying to make lots of people happy. That's their job, right? But please look for those parts of your ecosystem that are really thriving and focus on those. That can be difficult in the government, I know. And while the government isn't seen as the leader in culture, the government can have a big influence on culture. And what you want to do, the most important thing you can do is champion your founders. Make them heroes. Put their faces up on the subway. Make an ad about them, right? Give them a prize, right? Something like that. Maybe in Sweden, can we have the Nobel Prize for entrepreneurship? Any Nobel Prize people here, right? Do something that really recognizes them and makes them, elevates them. That's a big cultural thing that only the government can do. And then be like Sweden, those of you who are not Sweden. Build that technical infrastructure. The first thing I did when I got to SkyDeck was I make sure we had lots of fast, juicy Wi-Fi and a very good coffee machine. Transportation. So if you want founders to come and go, please have nonstop flights from San Francisco, which I could not take to get here. I had to go through Frankfurt. There must be nonstop flights in the summer, right? But in the winter, go to talk to SAS or whoever they are and get those routes going. That little thing can make a big difference. And then what can you nurture, but it has to grow organically? Of course, you cannot make investors come. Has anybody tried to make an investor do something? Yeah, it doesn't usually work that well. They came to Silicon Valley because they saw the talent bubbling out of the universities and research centers. So you can nurture it and invite them, but you can't make them come. You can't make those mentor networks happen. These are critical. What we like to say at SkyDeck with our program, the most important thing we do is we take a startup that needs to know something and introduce them to the person who knows that thing. And we do that hundreds of times a day between all of us, advisors, staff, et cetera, at SkyDeck. But you can't make it happen, but you can nurture it. And then, of course, the community life. I was happy to see at this event, there's a ton of side events, right? That type of thing, when that starts bubbling up from the bottom, you know you've had something that's worked very, very well. So let's get down to the key takeaways. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we've seen that haven't worked. And I've mentioned this a little bit earlier, but please be honest with yourself, your university, your government, your community development. Where is your talent? Who is your talent? Is it life science? Is it mobility? Is it deep tech? Is it consumer? And focus on that. You cannot boil the ocean. We're always telling our startups, right? Those of us who advise startups, you tell them don't boil the ocean, right? It is the same thing for a startup ecosystem. Do not try to do everything at once. You will have a whole bunch of non-product market fit things, right? So be honest with yourself and play to your strengths. Find out what your network superpower is. A good place to go is your best universities. So at Berkeley SkyDeck, we are part of Berkeley, so we're able to tap into this fantastic network of over 500,000 advisors and mentors who live around the world and work for free for us all the time. Do you know who they are? Berkeley alumni. Anybody here go to Cal? Any bears here? No? I know there's some in this room. In fact, I just met one. But you have that superpower. Your university, your community organization, something. Look for a way to tap into an existing network and energize them to help your startups. Remember, government, critically important. You own the beautiful concert hall, you make it happen, but you can't lead this. You can initiate programs, but you can't lead it. You've got to be patient, and I'm going to get to that very, very important thing in a minute. We already talked about this. Make founders your heroes. And then I would say, be patient. I was talking to the Consul General to San Francisco, the Japanese Consul General, and he said something interesting to me that reflected his culture. There was a big weakness that he saw that could become a strength, and that is that in Japan, as in many cultures, it's very homogenous, right? People do the same things, right? They like to kind of have the same kind of activities and the same sort of structures and traditions. So things kind of move along very, very slowly. But he said, what's going to happen with the startup ecosystem is that one day, all of that sameness is going to converge, and it's going to explode. I know in Sweden, you can have a somewhat homogeneous culture as well. Use that as a strength. Use that homogeneous culture, any characteristic of it, as a strength. And be patient, but have an incredible sense of urgency. Remember we talked about tempo? You need to feel like every day you're moving as fast as you possibly can. This is one of the biggest differences I see between founders in Silicon Valley and founders outside Silicon Valley. Outside Silicon Valley, the tempo just slows down. Make sure you don't do that. At the same time, be incredibly patient. You know how long it took Silicon Valley to become Silicon Valley, right? Decades. Things move faster now, but it takes decades, so be patient. And then whatever you do, you ecosystem builders. What's happening right now in generative AI is one of the most monumental technological developments of our lifetimes, if not several lifetimes. Don't miss out. You hear me say this, you're going to hear a lot of people say this. Massive changing world companies will be built. Make sure your ecosystem is one of those. Take advantage. So I'm going to leave you with what I hope your ecosystem all sounds like, and that is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, conducted by the great Gustavo Dudamel. Maestro, please play the music. And I hope that when it plays, which will be any minute, that your symphony of innovation, like Beethoven's, is one of the greatest and most wonderful symphonies ever built. And you can kind of picture it in your head, right? The da da da. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Beethoven.